As the Iran war rattles the global economy, some U.S. allies are making an unusual request: permanent access to an endless supply of U.S. dollars.
I understand that the UAE is looking for a swap line.
The swap line would both benefit the UAE and the U.S.
That's not a small request. United Arab Emirates is nowhere close to those major central banks which had unlimited standing swap lines in terms of its financial interconnectedness with the United States. They cited the examples of the permanent unlimited swap lines that the Fed maintains with Canada, Switzerland, the UK, Japan, and the European Central Bank. They want to be part of that elite club.
Extending a swap line to the UAE on these kind of geopolitical grounds would be a little unusual for the Fed. Really what we're talking about here when we talk about swap lines is who has control over this immensely powerful financial institution called the Federal Reserve. If you're talking about whether politicians can have access to this multi-trillion-dollar pool of assets, then this is something that people should really pay attention to. Swap lines are a piece of financial plumbing that the Fed has set up with other central banks. It basically allows other central banks to get access to the US dollar in emergencies. If Japan, for instance, needed access to its Fed swap line, the Bank of Japan, the central bank, would reach out to the Fed. The Bank of Japan gives the Fed yen and it receives dollars in return. And then it would use those dollars to distribute to banks in Japan. They're meant to be sort of day-by-day ways to make sure there's enough dollars in the financial system of another country so that there isn't a sort of market problem that would cause problems for the US or other countries in the global financial system. Fed swap lines are kind of special. In part, that's because the dollar is special. And the Fed is the only central bank that can give access to dollars like that.
The Fed backstop is unlimited, and that makes the Fed backstop a much more credible and valuable asset for these major central banks. I think one of the dangers of pursuing this financial diplomacy is that you risk alienating other countries. Saudi Arabia could well ask, why is UAE getting this lifeline, this status, and not us? The UAE has taken some of the biggest hits in the region from Iranian drone and other attacks. This has obviously damaged their economy. It has also, I think, longer term, diminished the luster of the Gulf in general, but particularly Dubai, as a financial center. They would view this sort of token of support from the US as something that would greatly raise their prestige.
The request that we're talking about now really sounds like a kind of geopolitical or foreign policy consideration, and that isn't usually how we've thought of swap lines before. At the end of the day, it's not actually up to the Treasury, it's really up to the Fed, and the Fed has not commented at all. So we really don't know whether or not the Fed is seriously considering it. For decades, the Fed has said all of these powers are exclusively ours to use. Politicians often hate what the Fed is doing and try to intervene. This is, of course, what we're seeing with President Donald Trump over the last year or two. In written comments to senators, Fed Chair nominee Kevin Warsh has said that Fed officials are not entitled to the same special deference in areas affecting international finance. A lot of people who've worked in the Fed in the past don't agree with this view and think that, this idea that you can separate these things isn't right. But Warsh's comments suggest that he thinks that the Fed ought to work with the Treasury in setting up swap lines and maybe should take into account some of these bigger foreign policy or geopolitical considerations that the Fed wouldn't normally have thought of.